Choose a name that sounds vaguely Asian. Kim Crisci. And people might believe that you're Asian until you get exposed in a Google Doc on Twitter. Well, it happened again. Another white author pretending to be a person of color. You're probably wondering what instance I'm even referring to. Is it Freda's Moon? Is it that one white author who did literal blackface in order to write a book? Or the most recent white person posing as an Asian author under the alias Kim Crisci in order to pitch her books as own voices? Yeah, I can barely keep up either. Hi, if you don't know me, I'm Kat. I post pop culture and book content here on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok. Check it out if you want, but otherwise, let's get into the video. I am going to very quickly recap this latest instance of literary Asian fishing, but I'm not going to focus solely on that because I feel like other people have already made summaries, and I also want to focus on this not being just like one instance of this happening, but actually a long-standing literary tradition of Orientalism. Lately, every time something like this happens, there are people saying like, oh my god, Yellowface was a prophecy, or Yellowface wasn't supposed to be a how-to guide, and they are of course referring to R.F. Kuang's novel Yellowface. In Yellowface, a white author plagiarizes an Asian author's manuscript and passes it off as her own while pretending to be vaguely Asian, from changing her pen name to something more ambiguous such as Juniper's Song, to choosing an author photo where she looks really tan and like is squinting into the sun so she looks more Asian. And as I very quickly recap the case of Kim Crisci, you will see that the similarities are indeed astounding. But like I said, this is not a one-time thing. This is something that keeps on happening, and not only in recent times, but something that has happened throughout history. After doing the research for this video, I unfortunately learned so much that I wish I did not know about white authors pretending to be Asian. So rather than Yellowface being a prophecy, I would say it's more like a documentary with theatrical reenactments, because it is so close to real life. A note that I will be primarily focusing on authors Asian fishing in this video, simply because if I were to talk about every instance of a white author pretending to be a person of color, I think I would lose my voice. But also because I want to tie it into this idea of Orientalism and this idea of exoticism that I think these white authors are trying to capitalize off of. So very quickly, who is Kim Crisci? Kim Crisci is the alias of a white author named Kim Crisci, and she was exposed in a Google Doc by a Vietnamese American author named Chi Tran Le. Chi was the moderator for a Discord writing group of which Kim Crisci was a part of. And after a few instances where it became clear that Kim was not actually Asian American but had been masquerading as Korean American, Chi kicked her out of the Discord group. There were a few instances that really tipped off Chi. One example is when Chi posts a work in progress where there is a Vietnamese American main character. They say that they're Viet, and then someone responds, "Oh, Viet, cool, I love pho." And this is a microaggression that Asian Americans are probably familiar with. But then Kim posts a comment that's like, OMG, why is this everyone's first instinct? I guess because we can't say, oh, you're Viet, you guys kicked our ass in the war, nice job. So kind of a weird comment. Chi also details another instance where Kim posts a work in progress and there is an Asian American character in it named Gina Wu, but the Wu is spelled W-U, and if it is supposed to be a Korean American character, then it would more likely be spelled W-O-O. So having these red flags raised, Chi tries to ask Kim, hey, what's your cultural background? Only to receive no real response, and after that, they kick Kim out of the group. After this, they are able to find examples where Kim is actually catfishing as an Asian person. In particular, Kim was using a certain profile picture where she is present in the photo, but she is way off to the side, and when the photo is cropped on X, the person who is in the center of the photo, who you would think is the owner of that account, is actually Kim's Asian friend. And Kim also started going by Kim Crisci on social media. Kim never explicitly states that they are a person of color or that they are Asian. Instead, there are some instances where it's pretty clear that people interacting with her believe that she is a person of color, and she realizes that, but she just lets it continue to happen and relies on their assumptions of her. There is one tweet where she says that she allows her profile picture to determine her POC status, which is like a really weird thing to say. And then there are also tweets where she is pitching her work and using the hashtag own for own voices, which means that your identity as the writer is reflected in the work. So it is implying that her cultural identity aligns with the cultural identity of her characters in the book. Kim did post an admission of guilt before privating her account and then later deleting it, which I will post here. The funny thing here is that she says that own voices in this case does not apply to race, but then doesn't really explain what it would have applied to, especially because she doesn't really have other like marginalized identities like disability, etc. that are listed in the pitch that people would be able to be like, oh, that's what own voices is referring to, besides the fact that her characters are people of color. So why did she do this? I don't know. Maybe she thought that it would give her a leg up in pitching, though you would only have to look at publishing statistics. And that might give you an idea of how easy it is to get published as a writer of color. And if you need that spelled out for you, it's not easier. Not at all. But whatever Kim Crisci's delusions and intentions were, she's far from the first person who has attempted to make a career out of pretending to be Asian. Let's rewind to the 1700s and talk about one of the earliest known instances of an author pretending to be a person of color, George Psalmanazar. I probably butchered the pronunciation, but don't worry because one, that's not even his real name, and two, this guy was super racist. George was a blue-eyed, blonde Frenchman who convinced a lot of the 18th century European elite that he was actually Asian. George claimed that he was a native of Formosa, which is the colonial name of what is now Taiwan, and that he had been kidnapped by a Jesuit priest and brought to Europe. He made a number of really quite outrageous claims about his supposed native land of Formosa in his book published in 1704 and his other writings. Of Formosan meal habits, George Psalmanazar wrote, "All who can live without working eat their breakfast about 7 o'clock in the morning. First, they smoke a pipe of tobacco, then they drink bohea, green or sage tea. Afterwards, they cut off the head of a viper and suck the blood out of the body. This, in my humble opinion, is the most wholesome breakfast a man can make." Psalmanazar describes an island nation populated by a skillful and learned people, yet it is a place which oscillates strangely between civility and savagery. His countrymen possess a very sharp wit and are capable of making pictures with great art and skill, as well as porcelain dishes, a technology unknown to European craftsmen. Yet they have no shoemakers, brewers, or bakers, and they use crude pine torches for lighting. And although Formosan parents refuse to beat their children, a level of tolerance unknown in Europe, they are also capable of appalling violence. Psalmanazar calmly explains his people have erected an enormous tabernacle where they sacrifice infants to an ox-shaped god to the tune of approximately 102,000 babies a year. So obviously this is a wild claim. And also the number of babies that they were purportedly sacrificing per year did not at all match up with the actual population of Formosa. So this is one of those claims that eventually led to people finding out that he was a fraud. So he also created a fictional language and writing system. And this is the funniest part to me, the most audacious part to me, is that he claimed that his appearance as a blue-eyed, blonde white man was just how the average person in Formosa looked. Clearly, it was a lot easier to pretend to be an Asian person in the past before like photographs were invented. But to be fair, people did question why he was so pale, and this was something that he addressed. Psalmanazar told an elaborate story about how the upper classes of Formosa lived in cool shades or apartments underground, which kept their skin chilly and white. This explanation made sense within then current assumptions about pigmentation. Although some ethnic distinctions existed during this period, modern categories of race didn't yet exist. There was simply no conceptual framework in place to ask the question, "Aren't you Caucasian?" What is so wild is that these are not even the most outrageous claims that he makes. Everything that he writes about Formosa sounds like this. It's all very typical, like Orientalist and colonizer tropes. Despite the audacity of his claims, George amassed a fair amount of fame, and his writings were widely read and believed among the European elite. Until he was eventually disproven, he ended up writing a tell-all that confessed how he was a fraud, and it was published posthumously. While the story of George Psalmanazar is absolutely bonkers, to say the least. I think it's also important to recognize that this story and this instance did not exist within a vacuum. In the 18th century, Europeans were beginning to develop a fascination with Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa that would become systematized into a framework known as Orientalism. A framework that created the Orient and Orientals as others, as the exotic, and as backwards compared to Europeans. Palestinian American scholar Edward Said, who wrote the book critiquing the role of Orientalism in European colonization, said, "Orientalism was ultimately a political vision of reality whose structure promoted the difference between the familiar, Europe, the West, us, and the strange, the Orient, the East, them." George Psalmanazar's Raging Lies existed within a greater context of travel writing that was growing in popularity in 18th century Europe, and a lot of this writing was focused on how different other parts of the world were. And a lot of these travel writings that were like anthropological in nature, that were attempting to study and systematize these so-called exotic lands, were so key and instrumental in creating this ideology that justified and enabled European domination and colonization of the East. This was the political, social, and cultural climate which allowed a fraud like George Psalmanazar to gain notoriety and fame and to make a career out of spreading Orientalist lies. This specific literary tradition was critical to the construction of Orientalism then, and their legacy continues to shape how the Western world views the world outside the sphere of Western cultural dominance. Highly recommend reading Orientalism by Edward Said if you have any interest in this subject at all. When I started reading this, a lot of different things I have experienced as an Asian American just kind of started clicking into place. It is so informative, not only for like representation in pop culture and media, but also for, you know, the stuff we see in the news and how certain countries are depicted, how certain wars are justified. I think everyone should read this, and this very much informed the direction of this video. Tangent over, let's get back to why authors pretend to be Asian. Because for some reason, this just kept happening throughout history. In the 1990s, American literary journals began publishing the poems of someone named Araki Yasusada. Yasusada was purportedly a deceased Hiroshima survivor. We know where this is going, and it is extremely effed up. So his poetry was about the bombing and his relatively isolated life afterwards. The story went that after his death, his sons found his poems and notebooks and began sending them to these literary journals. The notebooks, which were forged, include sketches, diary fragments, fun little details like smudged ink and illegible writing to make them seem more authentic. Of course, it turned out that Araki Yasusada did not actually exist, and that all of this was the fiction of a white man named Kent Johnson.
A white man? No!
I don't think I need to tell you how fucked up it is that a white man from the country that dropped 2 atom bombs on Japan then went on to create this delusional trauma porn figure who was a victim and the survivor of those atom bombs. Like, he was writing poetry from the POV of an atom bomb survivor, and then sending them to literary journals to get them published. I could probably go on about like the American fixation with Japanese culture, the fetishization of it, while at the same time those same people being like, yeah, Japan deserved it. Yeah. Anyway, that's not all. I have one last example for you. This example is one that I think many people suspect inspired R.F. Kuang's Yellowface, if it wasn't Lisa C, but that is probably a topic for a whole other video. I don't think she really qualifies under this video because she is actually Chinese, but there is certainly something to unpack with Lisa C. Moving on. In 2015, a poem titled "The Bees, the Flowers, Jesus, Ancient Tigers, Poseidon, Adam and Eve" by the poet Yi-Fen Chou garnered controversy when it was published by the Best American Poetry, along with a biographical note stating that Yi-Fen Chou was actually a pseudonym of a white poet named Michael Derrick Hudson. So what happened was that this poem was selected for publication, and then Hudson emailed the editor and was like, hey, actually it's a pseudonym, my name's actually Michael Derrick Hudson. And he claimed that he has submitted this poem 40 times under his own name. It was rejected 40 times, and it only took 9 attempts for the poem submitted under Yi-Fen Chou for it to be published. The editor of Best American Poetry, Sherman Alexie, decided to go ahead and publish this poem anyway, knowing that it was a pseudonym. His reasoning was that if he pulled the poem, it would only be to hide his own embarrassment, and he wanted to stand behind his editorial choices. If he loved the poem, he should love it no matter who wrote it. Alexie, who is Native American himself, admitted that he did give the poem a closer read because of the Chinese name. He wanted to more carefully read poems that were by women and people of color because he's very conscious of how underrepresented minorities are in publishing, being Native American himself. But interestingly, it was the fact that this poem was by a Chinese poet but primarily considered European culture that really intrigued him. The poem wasn't obviously Chinese, however you might interpret that, Alexie explains. Instead, it referenced Adam and Eve, Poseidon, the Roman Colosseum, and Jesus. It was, in other words, inherently obsessed with European culture. When I first read it, I briefly wondered about the life story of a Chinese-American poet who would be compelled to write a poem with such overt and affectionate European classical and Christian imagery. And I marveled at how interesting many of us are in our cross-cultural lives, and then I tossed the poem on the maybe pile that eventually became a yes pile. So this does speak to, like, you know, what Asian American writers are expected to write about, what interests Western audiences. If it had been a Chinese American poet writing about experiences that maybe weren't so aligned with Western and European culture, would it still be selected? The case of Michael Derrick Hudson might be used to say, hey, it is easier to get published as an Asian writer because he submitted this 40 times under his own white name, and it only got accepted for publication when he used a made-up Chinese name. People might be saying, yeah, there are diversity quotas. That's how it got published, by pretending to be Chinese. But I want to read this quote from Korean-American writer Alexander Chee. Alexander Chee points out that no one ever asked Hudson to prove that he submitted it 40 times and that it got rejected 40 times under his own name. Chee said, the only reason I can think no one has made him prove it is that he is a white man, and when white men in America say they are discriminated against, people just say, oh, okay, and do not ask them to prove it. Meanwhile, this case will be thrust at us as a sign that we are lying whenever we claim we're discriminated against. Additionally, I also want to read this critique from Huang, who wrote an article about this in The New Yorker. Maybe Hudson was right to believe that a Chinese name would distinguish his work in the world of American poetry journals, which are not generally filled with Chinese names. But conservative paranoia of quotas aside, the marketplace spoils for someone named Yi-Fen Chou are fairly meager. If a Chinese name were all it took, there would be far more authors with names like Yi-Fen Chou at the bookstore. Perhaps, too, spoofing the Chinese struck Hudson as a relatively safe masquerade, likely to provoke less generalized rage than, say, the fake autobiography of a purported ex-gangster or a Holocaust survivor. Or maybe it was simply more efficient. When it comes to such hoaxes, it seems somehow easier to fake Asia, a land still distant and inscrutable to many Americans. While other hoaxes work because of their thoroughness and care, the Asian-themed sort often get by with only a few details, as long as those details just seem Asian enough. This was written in 2015, and I have to say, with what happened with Kim Crisci, I feel like that still applies. Choose a name that sounds vaguely Asian, Kim Crisci, and people might believe that you're Asian until you get exposed in a Google Doc on Twitter. I also think there is a reason why white authors often pick Asian people to impersonate. There's like this added exoticism, but I think also this idea that the oppression and the racism that Asians face is not like real oppression or racism. So I think there's a combination of Orientalism where people are exotifying and thinking that, well, being Asian gives me a little mystique or whatever. And there's also this idea of the model minority myth where I think people think, well, Asians aren't really oppressed. I also want to add that Michael Derrick Hudson was successful because his poem was noticed by someone who was a person of color himself and was carefully reading poems by people of color because he was highly conscious of the fact that people of color are underrepresented in writing. So yes, the poem was published, but by taking advantage of an editor's good intentions to read more carefully poems by underrepresented writers. And when we look at actual publishing statistics, like who is working in publishing, how many literary gatekeepers are actually people of color? How many literary gatekeepers actually care about diversity? Because when you look at the reality, when you look at the statistics, publishing and writing is still very much a white-dominated industry. You can see statistics of who's actually working in publishing. It's still like over 70% white. These are the people who are choosing which work will be published. These are people allocating marketing budget to make sure that books go on to become bestsellers. So it's really no surprise when you look at the New York Times bestseller list or Goodreads Choice Awards and see like the number of books written by people of color is still extremely low. If you are having to pretend to be a member of an oppressed group in order to get your book published, maybe it's not your racial identity that is the problem. There's also so many double standards for Asian writers and writers of color where, you know, they have the burden of representation because there are so few writers of color. And I think anyone who cares about diversity in books and publishing in any capacity would realize how difficult it is. As someone who has been on Book Talk for the past few years, primarily talking about books by people of color, it is really wild the difference between what most people think of as book talk and what like I see on my feed, because I purposefully follow creators who talk about diverse books. I purposefully follow authors of color. But if you don't purposefully curate that, then you're getting fed like Sarah J. Maas and Colleen Hoover. Even if you're like into literary fiction, you're only getting like white authors who write literary fiction. It is something that you have to be very purposeful about when you are trying to read more diversely. And with these authors pretending to be Asian or whatever in order to get their books published, it's like it's a costume that they can put on. You know, they can change the profile picture, they can change their pen name or whatever. But if you actually are a writer of color, you're not able to change that. A lot of this reminds me of the Kate Corain situation where a white debut author was review bombing a bunch of debut books by authors of color, all under the same imprint, because she was specifically review bombing only authors of color. And in her public persona, she was someone who was very much like ally, like I care about people of color and diversity. But it really makes me reflect on the specific kind of racism that would drive someone to masquerade as a member of an oppressed and marginalized group because they think that it gets them benefits. I think a lot of it stems from this anxiety that when they're seeing people of color get more opportunities, even though the gains are very marginal, like yes, we're seeing more and more authors of color getting published, which is really amazing. We're seeing more diverse stories, which I am so grateful for. But when you look at overall publishing statistics, it is still overwhelmingly white. And when you see which books get the most marketing budget, which ones are on the bestseller list, it is still so white. But I think when you are the member of this dominant group and you're seeing people from marginalized groups suddenly get a little bit more of the pie, then there's so much anxiety around like, well, where's my slice? How am I going to get the slice that I'm supposed to get? And instead of realizing that actually the industry is hopefully becoming more equitable, there's this impulse to blame the marginalized groups who are making progress and seeing them as taking something that is yours. Because that is how white supremacy functions in the US at least. Because when you are so used to being the dominant and oppressive group, anything that is moving towards equity feels like a threat to what you think you are owed. If you've watched this far, thank you so much for watching. And if you're looking for more diverse authors, more diverse books, definitely check out my other accounts. I post a lot about books on my Instagram and TikTok as well. I am honestly hoping to make this my primary channel because I love creating for YouTube and it just feels like more creatively fulfilling. But obviously still growing this channel to the point where I can post more on YouTube. But in the meantime, definitely check out my other accounts because I have a lot of book recs on there. And if there's anything that you want to see from me here or on my other accounts, let me know as well. If you like this video, like, subscribe, all that stuff. Once again, thanks so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye.